Hello everyone, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to the socialprotection.org. I'm Fabio Veras from the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Today, we will have the opportunity to discuss a recent report about social protection in East Africa, produced by the OECD Development Center as part of the European Union Social Protection System project. The report covers 6 countries in the region: Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and Mozambique. It discusses how a number of demographic, environmental, social, and economic trends will shape the environment in which social protection systems will operate in each country for the next 50 years. These trends and the challenges they pose to social protection systems are particularly important given the emphasis that the African Union Agenda 2063 puts on social protection as a key instrument in its strategy to eradicate poverty and ensure sustainable and equitable growth. The report outlines 7 major challenges that social protection systems will have to face in the region, including the poorest of the poor, promoting social insurance in economies with high levels of informality and that are agriculture-based, generating employment for all, and particularly for the youth, which means dealing with the demographic dividends, the urbanization process, adaptation to climate change, and the financing of social protection. For all these challenges, some initial recommendations are put forward in the report. The report will be presented by Alexander Pick. Alexander is an economist in the social protection team at the OECD Development Center. He works on the European Union Social Protection System project. And before joining the OECD Development Center, he was a social protection specialist in the National Treasury of South Africa. After a 10-minute presentation by Alexander, we will have the comments by Flora Nyamba during 15 minutes. Flora is a leading expert in social protection and impact evaluations. In Tanzania, she has worked with RIPOA, a local think tank, for 5 years, since 2012. In RIPOA, she was the director of the Social Protection Research Program until 2015. She is currently a freelance senior researcher associate, and she is also part of the consultancy team responsible for giving technical assistance to the government of Tanzania in the development of an operation plan for the National Social Protection Framework. After Flora's comments, we will have Alexander and Flora answering to the questions that we will be submitting through the GoToWebinar chat bar. Please, you can see on the bottom right of your screen the chat bar in which you can send us your questions, and we will be asking these questions to Alexander and Flora. Please, Alexander, the web floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, indeed, as Fabio said, good morning and good evening as well, depending on where you are geographically. Thank you very much for joining today. It's very exciting for me to be able to talk a bit about this report, which we finished recently as part of the EU SPS, as Fabio mentioned. And it's really a very exciting time, if we just have the first slide, to talk about the issues that lie ahead of East Africa. This is a region which is really in some ways leading the way in developing social protection, not just within in sub-Saharan Africa, but indeed globally as well. There are some policy innovations happening, which the entire international social protection community is watching with keen interest. The nature, though, of social protection programs, as we all know, is that they're not necessarily just for today or for next year. Effective and sustainable protection programs that last 10, 20, 30 years. In some cases, that's not necessarily a good message for policymakers to hear when we're thinking of cash transfers or safety nets. There might be a sense that the region is moving so fast or a country is progressing so well that this might not be an issue, this shouldn't be an issue, rather we should be thinking beyond social protection. But what we've seen in every country really is that social programs can have a much longer shelf life than its designers initially imagined, and that it's very important to get them right at the start, not just in terms of responding to today's needs, but also allowing your social protection system to respond to what's coming down the road. And that's really the purpose of this report, is to support the region and East Africa, but also the African Union as a whole, which is getting firmly behind social protection now, in developing programs that are effective over a long time horizon based on the kind of challenges we see. So the purpose of this report was really to look at the demographic, social and economic trends that are happening at the moment, see what, or that lie ahead, see what this means for social protection, and then see how social protection can respond to these, can turn what are challenges into opportunities, can bend the curve to its advantage, and really use social protection to leverage the potential of its workforce, of its economy, and of various facets that they have at their advantage. So we looked at 6 countries for this study: Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. These are countries that are very similar, so in some regards, so that we can use what we see in East Africa to compare with what's happening in other parts of the continent. But at the same time, they're different enough between each other. They have very interesting kind of narratives and histories, even over the past 20 or 25 years, that enable us to kind of contrast and see how these long-term trends are going to affect each differently, and what this means for social protection. So if we move on to the next slide, the basis really for the model is the demographic projections. These are based on the 2015 UN World Population projections, and these are the projections that show the population increasing from 1 billion last year. This is the sub-Saharan African population increasing from 1 billion last year to 4 billion by the end of the century. Now, that's a long time away, and a lot can change between then. So demographics in this case aren't necessarily set in stone, but certainly previous experience shows that with the various different regions, that these data are very reliable. These projections are reliable over the next kind of 30 or 40 years. Then the further we get out there, the greater the capacity for these projections not to materialize. But as I say, I think these are pretty reliable for the next the next generation or two. There are important caveats, however. They're reliant on census data, and depending on when the last census was taken in any of the countries, then that can affect the quality of the input data. So even the historical data for the projections is considered estimates rather than information that is validated. And another important point here is that international migration doesn't really feature particularly. At the moment, the projections only extrapolate trends rather than predict some kind of endogeneity between population growth and migration. These population projections are allied to the urbanization prospects, which are again from the United Nations. These go up to 2050. The issue with these is that every country defines its cities slightly differently. The prospects takes the national definition rather than tries to enforce one of its own. But nonetheless, this is a very sound basis for looking ahead at what global cities will look like up to 2050. And allied to these as well, we've used some health projections to understand the health transition. So this is something that accompanies the demographic transition. Typically, you see the health needs of a country change as it ages, as its economies develop. There's an important interaction there, which is obviously of significance for social protection. And finally, climate models. This isn't something that I have any expertise in, but there are plenty of people out there who do, and so we tried to reflect some of the latest thinking on how climate change will affect East Africa when we're putting together this report. So the story, the demographic story, we will see in the next slide, of East Africa is one of extraordinarily fast population growth and a very slow decline in fertility. So what you see, and I'm not sure how clearly this is on your screens, but the top chart shows the decline in fertility rates between 1965 and 2065, and where we are now is roughly in the middle of that red circle. And the graph, and this is based on the population prospects, the graph shows that the fertility rates are declining at this point. There's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that they're not, which is a real concern, and there's lots of some literature around why that might be the case, but that's certainly an area which I think policymakers need to be taking into account. Based on these rates of fertility that we see, which are hovering around 5, total fertility rate of 5 women per 5 children per woman, rather. The population growth in the populations of the 6 sample countries will triple on average, or just less than triple. So we see all of the countries showing strong growth. And the next slide just demonstrates what that does to the age structure of the population, and it shows the growth as well. So on the left-hand side, you have the population in 2015, and there's the bulge is very much at the bottom. The age cohorts get much smaller as you go above the age of 50, which really shows that the population of these countries is extraordinarily young. By 2065, the bulge has moved up to the top, and you see it's much more of a sort of an even distribution across the age structure. Obviously, the population's grown considerably across the 6 countries, but we see that the aging of the population is going to be much more of an issue. The next slide takes us to the urban-rural divide. Interestingly, East Africa is the least urbanized region in the world, and that's reflected in these figures. There are 2 interesting stories here. First is the fact that unlike most other places in the world, there's urban growth and rural population growth. And so given where we're starting from now, yes, the urbanization will be very rapid. The population growth is expected to happen at a rate of about 4% a year, but at the same time, the rural population at present is so large that it'll take a long time for that the balance to shift. And by 2050, in the majority of these countries, the rural population will still be bigger. So therefore, the rural population will roughly double. The urban population will quadruple in size, but these rural populations will still be very big and very at risk, therefore, from climate change, among others. Factors. Now, once we have these population projections, the next slide just shows how we turn those into an economic model. And it's not a particularly sophisticated general equilibrium model. This is just quite a straightforward model that that seeks to incorporate long-term productivity growth with population growth, and what we're seeing at the moment in terms of structural change of the economy. So the shift from agriculture to industry and services. It's based on the methodology is based on an excellent paper by Fox et al. From 2013 called Africa's Got Work to Do. And what we've done therefore is forecast a level of productivity growth for the next 50 years and just shown how the size of the economies will respond to that level of growth and what that growth means for the structure of output and employment, as well as long-term poverty, based on the assumption that inequality stays at roughly the same level as it is now. And so there isn't any interaction between the poverty rate and the changes we might see to the structure of output and employment. So this is a simple model, but it's really more of a projection. And as we know, a projection is not a forecast, but a very important means of seeing how key variables within the system interact. So the next slide shows well, to an extent, it shows the demographic dividend. It shows the large working age population and the reduced, the dependency ratio will fall as this young population of today reaches age, and the labour force grows as a result, and each member of the labour force has a certain degree of productivity. This pushes the growth of the economy forward. So those are the black dots you see showing average GDP growth across the 50 years, and in all of across the countries, they average around 4% GDP growth, which is pretty good. It's not as spectacular as what we've seen since perhaps the early 2000s until now, but East Africa is actually growing faster than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, and this suggests that it might well continue to do so, and there's the successful the economic success we've seen recently should continue to a certain degree. The blue bars, however, show the impact of population growth in diluting these gains at an individual level. So in terms of per capita growth, you see the rate falling, for example, in Zambia, from the GDP growth is between 4 and 5%, but the per capita growth is less than 2% because the population is just that much larger, and so the gains have to be distributed that much more broadly. Now the next slide shows what this means for the structure of the economy as a whole, so agriculture, industry and services. And it's not immediately intuitive what's going on, but you have the 6 countries at the bottom, and each has 3 bars showing how the structure of their economies has changed between 2000 and 2010. And the third is what would happen if the structural change that we've seen thus far continues in the same way until 2065. And what's striking is that agriculture, which is the light blue lines that you see, the dark blue lines at the bottom, that's still a significant part of the economy going forward over that time frame. Now that translates, for the next slide, into labour force projections, and what the methodology does here is it distinguishes between formal and informal, or rather wage and non-wage across the workforce. And so what we're left with is these. For example, we have Ethiopia, and we can extrapolate what will be where the Ethiopian workforce will be employed in 2065. And as these pie charts show, the proportion of the workforce in agriculture will certainly fall, but it won't fall by nearly as much as we'd like. And this is Ethiopia, a country that has grown, whose manufacturing sector has grown very strongly. It just so happens that the economy itself has grown very strongly, so as a proportion there hasn't been the kind of shift from agriculture to we haven't seen the growth of the manufacturing sector necessarily reflected in the overall composition of output as much as you'd think. And as a result, we see this slow change of the structure of the economy, and as a result, large agricultural workforces and also large informal workforces in household enterprises. Meanwhile, the formal sector has grown from, or is projected to grow from 12% of the workforce today to just 18% in 50 years' time. Now, this is a very stark conclusion, and 50 years ahead this might not materialize, but this is based on the current trends, and there really is a sense that this reflects not only the kind of the economy, the way the economies are shaping up, but also the population growth, the ability of these economies and the labour force, the formal labour force in particular, to really absorb the sheer number of people who are entering the workforce. And across the 6 countries, the demographic projections show that it'll be roughly 7 million new entrants to the labour force per year for the next 50 years. So that's an extraordinary onus that the labour market has to bear. So that's the economy, and the next slide just shows you what this means, what these growth rates mean for poverty. Bearing in mind the first Sustainable Development Goal of eradicating poverty, if we look at the extreme poverty in the 6 countries, we're not going to get there nearly as quickly as we would like to. So you see on the left-hand side the percentage of the population, and on the right-hand side the absolute numbers. What we see is on the left-hand side the headcount poverty rate is declining, but in terms of the absolute number of poor individuals, in most of the countries, it's not much different in 50 years' time to where we are today. And even in terms of the poverty rate, it's still comfortably above zero. Interestingly, the drivers here are both population growth and the level of inequality. So that determines the latter determines the rate at which the bottom of the income distribution really benefits from economic growth. And the country that performs best, and that's the unbroken line in both graphs, is Ethiopia, which has the lowest fertility rate at present and the lowest level of inequality. And sure enough, that shows the quickest declines in poverty. On the other hand, Zambia has a very high fertility rate still and very high inequality, the highest in the sample. And that's why its poverty rate takes such a long time to decline. It's still hovering around the 20% mark in 2065, and that's extreme poverty. And meanwhile, I think its headcount is expected to increase over this time frame. And that chimes with the World Bank report that showed, I think, poverty in Africa falling from 57% in 1990 to 43% in 2012, but the absolute number of people in sub-Saharan Africa who are poor increasing by 100 million. So that's really the picture that we, this is the context of social protection going forward. We have high informality, stubborn poverty, and a population at significant risk of climate change, as well as a rapidly urbanizing population for which the structure of the economy might not change quickly enough to create the to match the aspirations or to create the kind of jobs that people have in mind when they move to big cities. These are all issues where we would think, or we believe, and the evidence suggests that social protection can make a big difference. And so the next half of this presentation and the latter half of the report just talks about how social protection can respond to these trends. So the next slide just shows that we've distilled these into 7 grand challenges for social protection over the next 50 years. There's the last mile problem of extreme poverty, and looking at the previous slide, last mile might be a tad optimistic, but it's really the idea that poverty is going to be very slow to decline, much slower than I think people policymakers have envisaged, based solely on strong economic growth alone. Then promoting social insurance in the context of high informality. This employment challenge, especially, which is going to especially be felt by the youth, the people who are joining the labour market over the next 50 years, who are in many cases going to be in such abundance that the labour market simply will find it extraordinarily difficult to accommodate them. The social protection and urbanization, and then climate change, and the demographic dividend, which is really where this is all leading, because that's the story of Africa in the century, is going to be the extent to which its demographics are a dividend or a disaster, to use the World Bank's phrasing. And all this will require a step change in financing for social protection if we're going to, if policymakers are going to address these challenges. So starting with the last mile problem on the next slide, what we see is these increasing in absolute terms, the reduction, even in the context of reducing in relative terms, and the case is not only made, but it's also accepted for a large increase in social assistance spending, which is what we're seeing across these 6 countries and across the sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. There are, however, challenges with this, not least the fact that many of the benefits seem to reach the people who don't need it. So there are these areas of inclusion, people who are higher up the income distribution, further along, and who seem to be absorbing the majority of the benefits. At the same time, the people at the very bottom, and this really is the sort of the last mile, the people that are hardest to reach, receive a very low proportion of total expenditure on social assistance, and this is very obviously runs counter to the objectives of these programs, and it's also very challenging when trying to make the case for the poverty impact of social assistance. But nonetheless, as we look ahead for the next 50 years, there's significant hope that this can be improved. There are rapid advances in technology that should facilitate accurate targeting, and there's also just the kind of the peer learning. The more these programs are implemented in various different places, then we will learn more from them. This potential for South-South learning and cooperation, I think, is hugely important here, and I think we will see social assistance becoming much more effective. But at the same time, policymakers today have to take a choice, and this report urges that eliminating errors of exclusion is more important than eliminating errors of inclusion. So instead of focusing all our efforts on preventing the people who don't need it getting benefits, then really focusing on ensuring the people who are most in need receive benefits seems to be more important. Well, it seems to be very important if we're going to make a dent on poverty. And this is not easy. There was a recent World Bank paper just showing that the proxy means test, which is a favorite means of an important mechanism for targeting, it's very hard to get right, and it's not necessarily a question of capacity so much as just information. So there are hard decisions to be taken on that. The next slide, talking about about social insurance. This is an area where sub-Saharan Africa is making a big push, but from a very low base. So coverage of social insurance arrangements is below 10% across the 6 countries, with the exception of Kenya. And this really is a reflection of the fact that such schemes are typically the preserve of formal sector employees, often in well-established firms or in the civil service. And the idea is that what we've seen is that that's not going to cut it. Social insurance is hugely important for preventing people from falling into poverty as a result of income shocks during their working career, and even more important when you have a population that's aging as a whole, which will happen 30 years hence in East Africa. And so getting social insurance right is not necessarily something that is not a nice to have, it's an absolute necessity. And there's evidence that things are improving, that Kenya's Mbao pension scheme is a sign of that, but there's certainly more that needs to be done in terms of understanding how these arrangements can be flexible to irregular contributions and irregular payments and payment schedules, and also how to reach informal sector workers. And there's the Spire Works initiative, for example, is a very nice one, and there's the idea that formal enterprises can act as contribution aggregators for the informal people who operate along their value chain. Is a very powerful one with great potential, and we will, I think, watch these kind of initiatives with interest, because this is a hugely important area. The third issue is around the next slide. Sorry, we'll talk to the employment challenge itself. So in a context where the formal labour market is going to struggle to absorb the sheer number of entrants, what can the government do? And East Africa is already answering that problem, answering that question through public works or public employment programs, as they're sometimes called. The systems of Ethiopia and Tanzania are really mainstreaming public works programs into their social protection systems through, for example, the Productive Safety Net program. And then it's a recognition that these programs can generate not only benefits for participants, but also huge positive externalities that can, for example, improve agricultural productivity, or typically improve infrastructure as well. But there's also a very important, there's a significant evidence of these programs not functioning as they need to, and really failing on a number of metrics to sort of develop, to provide outcomes that are better than a cash transfer would. And I think we've identified two key facets. The emphasis on useful work is absolutely essential, and twin to that is the idea of local ownership and local implementation. So it's the communities themselves who determine what is the best work, most useful work that can be carried out by a public employment program, but at the same time these programs have to be coordinated centrally to really kind of achieve, if they're going to operate at scale and achieve the kind of their potential in terms of as a labour market instrument rather than just as kind of a mechanism for granting local poverty relief. Then there has to be that kind of central coordination, and there has to be an expansion in terms of what work is considered appropriate for public works programs. South Africa's expanded public works program is a very good example of that. It has moved quickly beyond infrastructure towards environmental and social services as well as community projects. But there's no, the intention is not to create a kind of a stock of workers on these programs who join a public work program when they're 18 and retire age 60. They simply cannot accommodate that kind of participation. They still must remain, to an extent, short-term programs, but with clear exit strategies through, ideally, livelihoods, social protections programs. And they should also be connected to other social protection arrangements, such as workers' compensation or perhaps even unemployment insurance. Workers' rights in these circumstances have to be safeguarded, and that's an integral part of making these things operate at scale. Otherwise, there's a risk they become a kind of a source of subsidized labor for the government. The risks are huge, but personally, looking 50 years ahead, I see these programs getting larger and larger. And the experience from India has shown that these programs can really operate at scale and at a cost that is not by any means extortionate. I think the Indian scheme runs at a cost of about 0.5% of GDP, but there are concerns about the quality of the output, and that's something that obviously pushes the cost up. The next slide is talks to the urban social protection challenge. In many cases in East Africa and beyond, the social protection has a clear rural focus, which is, relates to the fact that rural poverty rates have typically been much higher than urban poverty rates. But as and this is a global trend, in fact. But as urban populations grow, so too will the absolute number of poor. And what people are beginning to realize is that actually they don't know very much about what happens in urban areas, especially urban slums. But the evidence is emerging that broader measures of deprivation can be worse in urban areas than they are in remote rural areas. For example, in Tanzania, the levels of maternal and infant mortality are higher in the cities than they are in rural areas. And that really kind of speaks both to the levels of deprivation, but also to the kind of to the challenge of accessing basic services, which really is one of the main draws of coming to the city, is that you'll be closer to schools, closer to health facilities, closer to work, but actually it doesn't always work out like that. And social protection has a clear role to play here, but it's not just a case of transferring rural schemes to urban areas. I think there's a lot of work needs to go into the design, and is going in. One of the greatest challenges is around this information deficit of understanding not only on an individual level, like where people live and who has income this week but not the next, reflecting the dynamic of sort of urban existence, but also at a macro level, what are the drivers of urban poverty and its broader deprivation. The Urban Productive Safety Net program is leading the way in this regard. It starts in July, so very shortly, but there's been already significant challenges precisely on targeting, trying to understand exactly who the kind of the participants will be. But that's an initiative which we look forward to with great interest, because I think that's going to be the first of really a pioneer in this sector. The next slide concerns climate change, which is in some ways the obverse of the urban challenge, but at the same time they're are strong links. The rural economy collapses, then the pressure on urban centers is going to be all the greater. But there's a really nice body of evidence emerging showing how social protection is an integral part of a climate change strategy over the long term, which has the very happy advantage of increasing agricultural productivity in the short term. Again, this is an area where Ethiopia is performing very well, and Tanzania as well. The advantages to social protection are numerous. There's the fact that the resilience angle, the idea that you can help people respond to climate change before they are subject to some kind of shock or disruption in their income rather than afterwards. It's significantly more effective. So a social cash transfer has been shown to allow households to diversify their crops, or communities can climate-proof their infrastructure to a sense. And obviously the broader benefits of this are significant. When we're talking about, instead of kind of the chronic climate change, if we're talking about climate-related shocks, then social protection again can be much better than emergency assistance, which has been shown time and again to be expensive, to arrive too late, and not really reach the people that need it. Social protection programs have the advantage of being permanent and can be scalable and linked to climate early warning systems, so that vulnerable groups can receive support before the shock, before the drought occurs. This is something that is again happening in Kenya, in particular with the Hunger Safety Net program, by using with access to a social registry and the climate early warning systems, the government is able to see which groups are liable to be affected by a coming drought and increase benefits to them, or increase coverage of the program in response. And governments in the region are also promoting microinsurance for farmers as well, which is another important mechanism for both short and longer term shocks. So the next slide is really the last two are perhaps the biggest ones for the kind of the 50-year time frame. How, if Africa's destiny will be determined by how it harnesses these demographic trends, which are extraordinarily powerful, then the key is to, well, it's twofold. The dependency ratio has to fall quicker than it does, or even has to fall if we're seeing that there's a kind of a stalling in the fertility decline. But at the same time, there also has to be more people, and the physical capital has to be more productive. And so there are a number of ways, and there are a number of economic channels through which, I wouldn't pretend for a second that social protection holds the answer to all of them, but there are certainly ways in which it can contribute. Mainstreaming women's empowerment is extraordinarily important, and has been shown in various different countries that cash transfer programs that are specifically aimed at women are reducing fertility rates. But you don't have to look at just at that stage of the life cycle. Pension coverage, an increase in pension coverage can have, has been shown to have a similar effect. People don't have to rely on their children to look after them in old age if they can rely on the government to do so instead, and that helps reduce the fertility rate. Investment in human capital, this is something that social protection facilitates through enhancing access to education and health, but the evidence is emerging how important it is to get early childhood development right, to increase investment. And it's not just in education, it's also in health and social services. We'll see in a second, the next slide, that this is an area where the continent is, where this region is not doing particularly well, with the exception of Kenya. Coverage of, and this is just preschool enrollment, is below 30% in the 3 of the 4 countries for which we have data. But interestingly, in Kenya it's above 70%, and this reflects a kind of a reform that took place around independence, a kind of a big community preschool initiative. Which I think shows has some very important lessons. And the final, on the previous slide, but it's not worth going back, is just around how a well-run pension scheme can enhance the tendency to save, and also to ensure that these savings are directed into productive investments, which improve the productivity of the economy in the long run. And so the aging population actually sort of generates what's known as a second demographic dividend, where the savings that are converted into investment increases the productivity of the economy, makes for bigger and better factories, and the economy benefits as a result. So the final one is perhaps the hardest of all of these challenges, which is how to find the money for this, because I'm not pretending in any case that that in any way that these are necessarily free initiatives. There's huge amounts of there's great synergies between them, and great capacity for efficiency gains. But I think the African Union is right when it says that social protection will have to rise from around 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP across the continent if it's really going to have its impact. And what we're seeing in these 6 countries is that challenge is made all the harder because they're approaching middle income status, or they reached it already, and as a result, as they get wealthier, the support that they'll receive from official development assistance is likely to decline. So there's a real push for domestic resource mobilization. This is, for example, in Ethiopia, which is committed to funding the productive safety net program by itself within a pretty short time frame. And this is a tough challenge, and it's made tougher by the fact that taxes in themselves can they reduce consumption, they reduce people's income, they can increase poverty, and if the social protection program that a tax is funding isn't large enough or isn't effective in offsetting this impact, then the overall tax and transfer system can end up hurting the poor, even in a context where you're scaling up social protection. So understanding the fiscal incidence, who benefits, who pays, what is the impact on incomes and poverty of taxes and transfers is very important, and that's emerging as a strong trend on financing social protection. Just to give some ideas around revenue generation, improved compliance administration is hugely important, and investment by the development partners in those kinds of programs is being recognized increasingly. Progressive income tax and property taxes are much less likely to hurt the poor, and in a context where if you have a formalization policy, which seems to be would come in handy right now, that can yield very good benefits. But at the same time, the increase in the cost of employment can reduce the fertility. So there is, it can reduce the compliance. So there are concerns there. And finally, and this is an area where again we all bear some responsibility, is that the tax avoidance, the broader BEPS initiative that we're very keen on here at the OECD. This is something the international community can play a huge part in increasing the corporate revenues that go to developing countries. And on better spending, there's increasing evidence to the benefits from shifting from subsidies, whether it be food or fuel or energy, to social protection programs, and likewise, as already mentioned, the effectiveness of moving from emergency aid to developmental social protection programs. And these last 2 slides, the first just shows that what is needed to increase tax revenues. These are the 6 countries. Now, this data actually, it's not, I wouldn't swear by it, but it gives you a pretty good impression that the countries are hovering around the kind of 10 to 15% of GDP mark for their tax revenues. And this isn't, when you talk about moving from 2% to 5% of GDP in terms of your expenditure, that's asking an awful lot of your tax base. So there's clearly strong growth, strong scope for improvement there, especially as there's not really an upwards trend, which is perhaps the most disappointing thing. Even in this period of strong economic growth, there hasn't been an increase in tax revenues that has exceeded that. So we're not seeing greater efficiency or greater tax effort. And then the final slide just gives you a sense of the scale of slides. Actually, this slide is about ODA in Ethiopia, which is has declined very quickly, and this is just from the DAC members. So this doesn't include assistance from every country, but it shows that in dollar terms, the commitments just haven't kept pace with the rate of the growth of the economy. So that's a very sharp decline, and that doesn't reflect a kind of a concerted or a sort of a deliberate effort on the part of the donors. It's just the dynamics that we're seeing. And what's interesting is you can see the light blue, the kind of the growth in the production sector as the economy sort of picks up and there's more scope for sort of productive investment, then we'd expect to see that grow and support for social infrastructure perhaps diminish. And then finally, the final slide, sorry, concerns the savings from energy subsidies. And when we're talking about, if we say roughly a safety net program can be run at a cost of about 1.1 or 1.2% of GDP, and we see the scale of subsidies as a percentage of GDP, you see that there really is huge potential for moving from one to the other. But this is not a straightforward process, it's not automatic, and requires an awful lot of political sensitivity. So that is that, and thank you very much for your attention. I hand over to Flora, to whom I apologize for probably talking too long.
Okay, thank you, Alexander, for this very interesting and thorough presentation. I would like to call Flora now to join us and to make her comments. Go, Flora. Flora, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabio. And hi, everyone. And thank you for joining us in this session. I would like to maybe first just alert. Sometimes I'm speaking from Tanzania, and sometimes network has been creating some issues. So sometimes I may go on and off. Please help me alert when that happens, and we can see how to, maybe I can pause or do something on that. I would like to start by thanking the team and Alexander and your team for the work. This is really great work that you have done on this report, and it is very helpful for myself and my colleagues, professionals, researchers, and other people who are committed in the work of social protection and seeing social protection making a difference in the lives of the many poor people and their lives. We are pleased to see this kind of work that can help us guide and lead us as we move on, but particularly learning from what has been happening and learning to, many ways or several ways that we can now move on or move forward to be successful and to better the lives of these people. I wanted to start by commending or appreciating the fact that the report recognized the various definitions across these countries of sample, and I believe many other countries in the world would have their own definition, whether originating from the country or from the evidences or facts or lives in their country, or adapting from some of these international organizations like ILO, UNICEF, etc. But in the end, a definition that reflects the reality of the lives that they live in. And this is important, particularly due to the way you define, be it implicit or explicit. Sometimes the definition is existing formally, but sometimes in many other times there are some aspects that may be existing and informally, like formally and informally. In the way, for instance, the traditional aspect of the social protection in Tanzania, for example, for a long time, traditional way of handling people or like special conditioned people has been perceived as like a family issue rather than a formal definition or a role that the government has to take up. And very recently, when the new social protection framework, which hasn't been approved yet, the draft has incorporated in the definition the recognition of informal or traditional social protection, which in the sense, I believe it helps in the future when there is budgeting or financing considerations, just recognition that the government has also to take part or to take role in that rather than leaving that whole burden in the shoulders of the family members. As an example, recently, 3-4 years ago, when I was still at REPOA, myself particularly teamed up with a team of professors at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and conducted a study on social, the inclusion of people with disabilities in social protection in Tanzania. Part of what we found is that generally the communities, the government as well, considered the burden of handling these people as part of the family work. As such, there was a lot of theoretical mention of okay, there are theories that identify that people with disabilities have rights, have needs, but in practice, when we went wasn't even a list of saying in this community how many people with disabilities exist and what are the specific needs that the rights. So that was existing. Highlight this as well on this page. So in the budget side, for the same example, the budget was very, very, very minimal. And what happens in such situations when in governments like my own, like in Tanzania, and I believe in many other developing countries, East African countries, for example, when the budget is very thin or slim, sometimes it happens, or many times it happens, that some aspects in the budget have to be dropped out, like budget cuts. And when such a situation like this case of people with disability, we found that when it comes to cutting budget down, those are the departments that face difficulties or are affected the most, because they are the first ones that are seen that there's an alternative as family members can take care of that. So it's important that, again, it's important that these people, this report has highlighted the fact that various countries can or need to define social protection in the way that in the end then they can produce indicators and implementation programs and plans accordingly compared to other countries. Now I wanted to also highlight another aspect on the financial resources. Allocation is an important aspect that has been highlighted in the presentation. Much as this is an important aspect, and particularly when you're talking on developing countries, this is very prime, I would say. But what goes with that, with similar importance or even more importance to me, is the political will to give social protection financing a priority, particularly when you are facing these financial difficulties. And with this commitment, it's good to recognize, for instance, the report talks about the natural generating revenues from within. That is an important aspect. So natural resources, for example, in using those natural resources, taxes or revenue that is coming from that is important aspect to build a more sustainable social protection. But if there wasn't, or if there isn't commitment, political commitment or government commitment, this kind of is ruined generally. There's an example in taxes. REPOA 3-4 years ago conducted a study on taxes, how much people are willing to pay taxes. Many people say that we are happy to pay taxes, but if we know that the tax that we paid is useful and is making a difference in the development program and development project. So to enforce or to make sure that there is emphasis in collecting these taxes, people want to also see, the government wants to ensure or needs to ensure that part of what is collected is being used, and people can see that their lives are changing because, or at least contributed by the taxes that they're paying. There's an issue of corruption. I wanted to also mention on that. When you're talking about resources, when you're talking about revenue generation, if corruption is in between, really there isn't much that can be achieved in the plans or in the outcome, the outcomes that are intended. So government combat and corruption should also come together and be foremost. We do hear stories of corruption. Many countries, developing countries, our leaders from top to very low levels in the government have been involved in such scandals, and we do have examples of how these have ruined even the financing that we get from within and from outside. So the report talks about the fiscal incidents. This would be an example or something that the country should consider, in the way that who is paying taxes also needs to know where the money is going, and not only in books, as it has been happening in many of these countries, but particularly seeing what is really happening. I'll give an example of the Productive Social Safe Net program that is happening, that is being implemented. This is a social protection program in Tanzania. The financing of it has been largely through donor funds and government loans through the World Bank. Now, there has been, for instance, some, I would call like bargaining or arrangement where donors would like to make their commitments, and actually they have made their commitments, and it's been about 3-4 years now since the program started running, since 2012 until now, about 5 years now, and the government had made a commitment as well. Now, making a commitment for our governments is one thing, but making sure that they fulfill the commitment is another. And this, in Tanzanian case, has made an issue, because now donors are at the point that, okay, we want to see what you had committed. We want to see it moving. And so otherwise, they're saying otherwise when it's up a certain year, I think they're talking about 2018 or 20, in 1 or 2 years to come, otherwise they're going to pull out. So such commitments or such action should be real emphasized. When you have this commitment, even if you recognize or understand or put it in papers, the commitment to make sure that the implementation takes place or fulfillment of the promises take place becomes very important. I wanted to also highlight the issue of access to knowledge, adoption and use of advanced technology in the delivery of social protection programs being important. I know the report highlights that, but I also wanted to also emphasize the fact that the implementation of social protection programs in East African regions has been, actually the social protection program, itself is relatively new compared to many other like Latin American countries that started early on. The implementation of cash transfers program is quite new in my country, in some countries about 10, maybe 15 years ago. Now, we need to learn to move with the technology. Some of the practices, like the delivery of cash transfers, for instance, in several countries, Tanzania, for example, has been through cash, like actual cash delivery, and that has a lot of challenges to come with. Now, the program is thinking about electronic payments of these transfers, but that has also other challenges behind it. It doesn't come easy. So as much as it's important to recognize that we have to move with advanced technologies, it's also important to resolve the issues and the challenges that come with the penetration of that technology, especially in the rural communities, rural majority of the populations in these developing countries, particularly issues of illiteracy, like how much these people can use the technology, how much do they understand and adapt and fit within the implementation of the program. But also, as an example, there's a study that we conducted, financed by the Gates Foundation on digital financial services for women. One of the challenges that these women, particularly poor rural women, face is the ownership and affordability of the mobile technology. So when the efforts of the government to bring this technology locally happen, it needs also resolving some of the contextual issues, connectivity issues, for instance, also need to be resolved. So there's a lot beyond what we are seeing or what has been mentioned in the research in terms of examples and in terms of what of where the one country is compared to the other country. But also the issue of coordination of efforts and resources for implementing social protection programs. I wanted to raise that this is an important aspect, particularly in these countries where you can have so many different social protection related programs going on at the same time, but knowing who is doing what may become a challenge. And sometimes even when you know that someone else is doing, even the recent competition of financing and organizations competing for funds, sometimes it happens that they still have to do because that's how they survive, that's how they get to live. But it's very important to have a way that these programs can be coordinated. Tanzania, for instance, is the National Social Protection Framework that I just mentioned earlier, is one of the efforts to coordinate the work and the implementation of policies and the implementation programs of, in terms of social protection in the country. I know, for instance, in Ethiopia, they combine programs, like they have this productive safe net program. The implementation of cash transfer is complemented by the food security program, the own household asset budget program. So, and evidence has indicated that when you combine, you get better outcomes from the two existing social protection programs. I wanted to insist or to emphasize that it's important that programs that exist within the country can learn ways in which they can be coordinated or combined in some instances for better outcomes. And unfortunately now, as I mentioned, competition may be within among the implementers of these programs, but in the end, we have to do for the benefit of the population. I also want to highlight the need for continuous learning within and beyond the region, East African region. When I say within, countries, like for instance, there's an example that I mentioned that Tanzania could learn how Ethiopia, for instance, is implementing social protection. And I know that the Ethiopian social protection program is largely implemented through public works. And Tanzania has implementation of the productive social safety net has an aspect, the public works as an aspect. And I now know that the government has requested this program to be reviewed, and they're actually looking forward to doing more public works if that will be approved. And so it is important to learn that who is doing what in the region, and the importance of learning and learning from the mistakes and success stories of these countries. Countries have learned a lot from the Latin American countries, for instance. The Bolsa Familia social protection program, for instance. There's been a lot of learning in terms of how they have succeeded to get where they are right now. It doesn't mean that they don't have challenges. They're still facing challenges, but the challenges that they're facing may be not as much, for sure, as the challenges that a developing country or a later developed social protection program may be facing. I know social protection program in South Africa where they have children's benefits, children's rights benefits, has been successful as well. But behind it, I think you'll be going back to what I explained earlier, the government's commitments, because these programs, the two programs, for example, the Bolsa Familia and South African program, have, I think, 100%. I don't know if there has been changes, but from what I know, it's 100% government financing. Now, when you have 100% government financing, you are in so many ways, or to a certain higher percentage, you are assured of sustainability, because then you know how you allocate your financing, how you get financing for it, if it's revenues that have been generated over time, or how to shape it, or how to shape the changes and trends. So that's very important, and these are the programs that we developing regions could learn from. And even within the regions, there are some who are advanced already and some who are lagging behind. If you can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to highlight some of the specific issues or things that I thought reading the category, the 7 grand challenges that the report and presentation highlights. The issue of informal, I picked a few. I'm not going to go through everything given time. The issue of informal insurance, for instance, the challenges include income uncertainties and affordability. Pension schemes, as an example, in my country, and I'm referring, I'm sorry, to some of the studies that I've been involved myself. I learned that in Tanzania, for instance, pension schemes have opened up to include informal contributors in the pension contributions. However, this is an unpublished research that was done, I think, 3 years ago through the poor, and people, when people were asked, why are you not contributing, because the contribution, the coverage is still very low. Now, when you ask about the reasons why people are not contributing, and the pensions have opened up to let them contribute, the issue came back to poverty and ability to be able to get sustainable incomes, like daily and monthly, to be able to contribute to these pensions. So I'm mentioning this because it's a very good example, it's a very good effort, and actually it's the reality that real coverage is very low in terms of formal contributory pensions or sectors, but the alternatives also have some embedded challenges that when we are working on, we need to also learn how we can resolve and make this go hand in hand. I know the Mbao pension fireworks in Zambia, but also there's a similar project in Iringa Forest that is under the Finnish government in Tanzania. They are also making this great effort or initiative to include the informal sector, as the report also has mentioned. But there is a lot of learning as well that has been experienced in terms of unintended outcomes. For instance, the public works program, in some places where public works program has been implemented in Tanzania, we have learned that there has been some gender, because in Tanzania women are the ones who are managing the cash transfer program money, also the public works program money. So there has been, example, in some of patriarchal, strong patriarchal places, there has been a trend where now male are leaving this to women, as this is women's work, this is women's program, simply because the women are the ones who are receiving the cash in the end. But we also know that, like this plan on the forestry in Iringa in Tanzania, the plan was to have maybe the people surrounding the owners of the forest to contribute, maybe like do some public works for a certain pay, a cash transfer pay for them. But then we need to think very carefully. I'm giving this as examples, how much that will promote inequality, for instance, and make these extreme poor people continue to work and promote, even if they're gaining, yes, something, but also how much they'll keep working on this, and how much gap is going to contribute between these public workers, public working extreme poor, and those who are already owning these forests and the projects that are related to the forestry. So this is just an example of precautions that we need to be sure that these initiatives are also well studied and explored in terms of what are the repercussions or unintended benefits or outcomes that may happen. I wanted to also mention really quickly on the over-coverage of social protection as it has been presented in the rural, the fact that rural communities have remained poorer and many extreme poor people, and so the well-being hasn't been improved as much, despite the fact that social protection programs have concentrated much in the rural. I was thinking, or I'm suggesting that maybe it would be good to concentrate, to also put much effort in improving the rural conditions so that we can minimize the transit of these people, I mean the immigration of these people from rural to the urban, but also improve the agricultural productivity for the majority rural dwellers, because that has been a big challenge, and that is contributing to the continued poverty in these rural areas, but also strengthen livelihood programs. I know the cash transfer and other social protection programs aim at strengthening the asset building and graduation of these extreme poor from poverty. So it's important that the programs in special protection should also focus on that. I know the report highlights, but it's important to also recall that majority of the poor lack the capacity to own assets and build long-term investments, and hence the graduation from poverty, I think it will take quite long. I understand this is an effort to kind of lead these people through several years to come. But these being issues, I think the area we start looking at it or addressing parallel to the suggestions of the report, it is important. Also analyzing rural and urban separately. Many reports, I would say, or studies miss in some ways. They may do this analysis separating rural and urban or comparing rural and urban, but we need a very intensive analysis, especially when we're doing studies that we intend to lead them into a certain new initiative or policy. It is important to compare and then innovate programs that will be separate for rural and urban. The high fertility rates, I acknowledge or I appreciate the fact that there has been an exploration and the mention or acknowledgement of the fact that high fertility rates is affecting, or it has to be worked on in order to reduce or to make successful social protection programs implementation. I wanted to just underscore the fact that religion and culture has always been contributing to this. For instance, Muslim communities, as an example, the family planning for them is against the religious belief. Now, when you we as social protection implementers make efforts to encounter these increasing family planning, fertility rates, we need strong strategies or specific strategies that will also work hand in hand with existing religious and cultural beliefs. The one aspect that I wanted to highlight is really major one in terms of developing countries in Eastern Africa, and that is the capacity issues in terms of research and in terms of implementation. The financing challenges, government, for instance, the reliance on donor funds which come with experts. I want to just highlight that, because when you have research and implementation capacities, and when at the same time the government doesn't have much financing for such aspects, and you have donor reliance, at the same time you expect these technical expertise and skills from them. Many times these donor funds have been coming in with technical experts. Now, how much, that is not bad, it's a good thing, but how much is that promoting collaboration and ensuring local capacities are enhanced and promoted? That becomes questionable, because this is very important. We need to partner and work with external experts, but in a way that also benefits and builds long-term and sustainable capacities for the locals. The growing trend for donor offices or branches in these regions, I think that is another issue that has that needs to be recognized or learned, or maybe further studied to see how we can leverage that, because many donors or countries, like donor countries or donor organizations or big research companies, are moving now into these countries. I have several examples here in Tanzania that I could mention, and that is actually that needs to be worked out, because in the end it makes local peoples fail to know how to compete or how to stand in order to build their capacity. So again, this is quite important, and I know the African Union, European Union social protection system are developing capacity programs for social protection and have been tested. For instance, this Transform program, I think it's in the socialprotection.org, that has been tested in Tanzania, and it's going to be tested in several other countries, which is a good step, and it will be helpful. I think I'll end there, but just one final, I know I'm out of time. I wanted to highlight on the issue of education projections. I think we needed to kind of hear that. I know there's a highlight of that in the presentation, but it was also important. But also the exclusion and inclusion errors issues in advice on countries like Tanzania that has combined 3 methods, but still we have such errors. So maybe that can come into the discussion as well. So thank you so much, and I'm sorry for exceeding a few minutes from what I was given.
Thank you very much, Flora. Very nice comments, very interesting. Expanding a little bit more on what Alexander has already talked to us. We have a couple of questions and comments from the audience that I would like to add to also to your comments, so that Alexander and yourself can react. So we have some comments coming from Kenya, from David Kamau from WFP. And basically he comments that the proposals presented by their report are equally challenging and worth exploring. However, it's high time that we regularly point out that weak governance and corruption is a significant barrier to this vision. That's something that Flora also mentioned in her comments. Another loophole that he highlights is that ought to be sealed, it's the tax avoidance and poor tax return plans by individuals and corporations. I think that's something that also Alexander highlights. So Alexander, if you could develop a little bit on this to be important. And then he finally saying that this tax avoidance, to avoid tax avoidance, would only happen if there is good governance. He also posed a question on how well can the countries in the case studies accelerate and enhance functional linkages between social protection and other sectors, so that synergies can be enhanced. We also have a comment and also a question from Wagner Sitoy from Mozambique. He highlights that population movements, migration, fertility rates are fundamental elements to control the population growth and consequently planning it. Specifically in the case of Mozambique, he thinks that what's lacking is a more equitable distribution of resources. But he thinks that before social protection programs are scaled up, it's important to have an analysis of how all these elements are linked. And he actually asks whether equitable distribution of resources in countries would allow social protection to be much smoothed and less pressured to reach its objectives. And then I would like to add a question actually on, stimulated by this last comment that Flora did on the thing of the targets and the undercoverage of the social assistance programs in East Africa countries. So one of the concerns that I had when I read the report was basically that the report was stimulating the scaling up of the programs, or that more resources should be spent on social assistance, but at the same time saying that the targeting should be improved. But in order to decide whether inclusion or exclusion areas would be more important, the exclusion areas should be more important in terms of policies to be reduced it. But the challenge here is that most of the social cash transfers that are basically the core of the social assistance programs in East Africa countries are actually targeted at those who are not able to work, the so-called unfit to work. Then with this type of categorical targeting, it will be impossible to cover, for example, the lowest quintiles of the population, because many of the poor, they are also able to work. So there is clearly a gap on the design of these programs, or whether either they are reformed in the sense that they can incorporate other categories, or other types of social assistance programs like active labor market policies or public works should tap in. But in the report and the evidence that we have, both of these types of programs tend to have very low coverage, and their evaluations are not as good in terms of impacts as the ones that have been done for social assistance or social cash transfer programs. So Alex and Flora, if you would like to comment, I pass the word to you.
Flora, would you like to go first?
Okay, I'll start with the question from Kenya that asked on how to well enhance our synergies. I think it's important to start with learning who is doing what, where is each of these countries in terms of development of social protection work. There is a lot to learn from. There is a lot of synergies that we can develop, but there's also a lot that we can collaborate and work together. And actually, comparative studies always are proven to be more advantageous, because then you are able to see the gaps, or where you are lagging and where you can learn from each other. So I think the most important place to start is learning who is the potential collaborator, and how we can generate these synergies. I know, for instance, in some think tank institutions in Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, where some studies that have been done in one country would have been very good learning in terms of where, for instance, we are in terms of implementing social protection, especially the cash transfer programs. Some are piloting, some are already in the scale-up phase. How about coming together and seeing where we can start? But also policies that are existing in terms of directing the manner in which research, like what type of research can be promoted. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that we want to collaborate in other countries, but at the same time we want to collaborate in the way that is meaningful, that we can learn, but they can also learn. I'm sorry, Alexandra, when I started writing about, reviewing the aspect of capacity strengthening, I looked at the acknowledgement of your report and seeing, okay, if we are talking about this study being implemented in these countries, let me look at the names. Who are the team members, at least coming from this country? I may not recognize from other countries, but I can at least know who in Tanzania, or at least someone from Tanzania, and I couldn't. And so to me, at least promoting spirits of working, recognizing, but at least involving people in those countries and making comparisons, I think that is a helpful way and a way that we can get started. Maybe I can jump into the targeting exclusion, inclusion issue. I see as the way the report has highlighted that we need to relate well until we get there, but at least we need to know that it's better for now to have inclusion errors, because then we are not leaving people who are in need out. That is important, but we also know that we all need to learn. Like for me, we also need to learn earlier than later in the implementation of these programs, how we can start reducing or eliminating those errors, so that the scarce resources that we are starting with, that we have right now, or we can start with in implementation, is more useful and cover more by eliminating these targeting errors. I'm not sure if I'm in the right track with that question. Maybe I'll stop there and I can go back with it.
Okay. If I can have a stab at some of these questions as well. Starting, Fabio, with yours on the the idea of who really qualifies, what categories of people qualify for different social assistance programs. I think you're absolutely right. But what is happening for the safety net programs in Ethiopia and Tanzania, for example, is this quite neat differentiation between the people who can work and they're in the public work component of the program, and then people who are direct support beneficiaries, which is effectively just a transfer and it's not contingent on them working. And so this is a nice mechanism for addressing exactly this kind of the issues that you identify in terms of the kind of the different types of people who are located in the bottom quintile or the bottom 2 quintiles. On the point around Mozambique, I hope I've understood it correctly. I think inequality here, and it doesn't necessarily come out enough in the presentation, maybe a bit more in the report, but it's absolutely crucial in terms of identifying determining the prospects of today's kind of lower income earners, today's poor. The projections show, and then this is just intuitive economic sense, that there are people just being left behind more and more as the economic distribution is skewed towards the people who are better off. It just leaves the others far behind, not only in terms of income but also in terms of opportunity, and the gulf just widens across the generations. So I think inequality here is a huge factor, and the less the lower the level of inequality, then the less role there is for the state or for public social protection schemes to play in terms of leveling that particular playing field. So they don't have to necessarily be as big, because there won't be as many people who are dependent on them to catch up. That's not to say they don't have a role to play, but it eases the onus, because the social protection programs that just perform a function of taking money from one group of people to give it to another to even out somewhat the kind of distribution of income, that's the kind of the most reductive sense of social protection, and it kind of going beyond that and really recognizing the kind of broader benefits of social protection programs is really where the future lies. So the lower the inequality when you start your program, the better you are. And that's not just about social protection, it's about a whole set of other policy measures. And just to go back, I suppose, to Fabio's point again, the issue raised about so prioritizing, it's better to include someone who doesn't need a program than it is to exclude someone who does. That's right, that is the message. I mean, if people have asked whether or not the kind of universalization is really the kind of basic income grants, that, you know, that's definitely a strand that is emerging, and I would stop short of that. But I think that is another pressure that you know, more and more countries are viewing this, and when you have poverty rates like we're seeing in some of the countries, and which are going to be quite stubborn, that pressure might not grow. So I suppose that's definitely an oversight in the report. You know, I don't explicitly mention what the position should be on, or would be, or what would be a tenable position on universalization of different benefits. Although it is interesting that Kenya has just, I think, presented to Parliament a proposal for a universal pension, which, if enacted, could be very good news. The final question on governance and corruption, but also the also tax compliance. You're absolutely right, and governance is a huge issue, and this is something that Flora touched on very well. All I think I can add to that is that there is certainly evidence that, you know, the social protection, if people get something out of the system, then it sort of builds a social contract. It encourages people to it's a very important part of state building if you have people who are paying in taxes and receiving benefits from the state. And I think if the state's social protection can be a kind of a real bellwether for a functioning state and for building compliance, and linking tax reforms, as sometimes happens, to a specific social protection measure. Often it's health actually rather than social protection necessarily, but that's proven to be quite effective. So sin taxes in the Philippines or other taxes, I think VAT in some countries has been linked, and that's worked very well. So there really is it's an area where the social protection can actually be a kind of a facilitator rather than just a beneficiary.
Okay, thank you, Alex. We have another question here. It's actually a question on migration by Andrew Mitchell from UNHCR. So he says there is a heightening focus on migration issues within Europe and increasingly globally. How can this be harnessed? Two at once put in place: one, a predictable humanitarian mechanism that covers citizens and non-nationals through adaptive social protection systems, while, and that is number two, expanding coverage for the very poor that may stimulate extra opportunities to remain in their communities, in strengthening social protection outside of emergencies, working to generate legal migration and tax remittances. Wow, that's huge. Who would like to tackle these two issues? I can repeat if you want.
Yeah, please.
So I think basically he's saying the discussion around migration in Europe and globally, and basically he's thinking on how this can be put forward in a manner that there would be, first, a predictable humanitarian mechanism that covers citizens and non-nationals through adaptive social protection systems. And second, the expansion of coverage of social protection to the very poor that may stimulate extra opportunities to remain in their communities. And then working together to generate also legal migration and therefore taxing remittances, I imagine as a way to fund also social protection. mechanism. I think in the report you also look at these dimensions. That's you.
Yeah, so there is a lot in well, there's not a lot. There's a bit in the report about this. There's a lot in those questions, which I certainly wouldn't count myself as qualified to talk about with any great authority. I mean, it's certainly a very interesting angle, the extent to which social protection in the home country can have an impact on migration. And I don't have the answer at all to that. It's something that I'd be very interested to know, but it doesn't necessarily. If you look at the age profile of people who the people who are most likely to migrate, it's people who are sort of the last to be covered by social protection. So it's people in their 20s and early 30s who are looking to work elsewhere and might not necessarily have families with them, and these are the kind of this is an age group which is sort of necessarily quite poorly by protection. They're not children, they're not elderly. There's a sort of gap, and there's a real, in the current context, constraints on providing support mechanisms for them domestically. And public works programs I've put forward as a possible part of the solution to that, but the returns are likely to be considered far lower than the potential of working in Europe, for example. I mean, on that figure though, and this is just in the report, if we look at the current labour force in Europe and the current labour force in East Africa, and assume that labour force participation kind of stays roughly the same in both areas, there is the potential for workers from East Africa to fill a gap that might be reflected in declining kind of fertility rates in Europe. There's no comparison. The numbers just don't match. There is not likely to be anything like sufficient demand from sort of wealthier countries to match the supply of demand from East Africa alone. So the numbers are completely out of scale, which raises a huge issue, and one that social protection, I think, has to contribute to in some way along the line. And just on that the question previously on of how to produce synergies that can exploit the potential of social protection in a broader way than we're seeing at the moment. This is an area where the Sustainable Development Goals and countries' SDG policy is really helping, because social protection features should in so many of the goals and these issues that we've raised in the report are kind of if you applied it next to the SDG matrix, then most bases would be covered in some way or another. So I think this is something that should emerge organically, but that's not to say that the case doesn't have to be made for it, because in a lot of cases it's kind of would be relatively innovatory. These policies would be quite innovative, and as a result there isn't maybe as much evidence as countries would like, but I think there's going to be a bit more daring showing in the next 20 years, I hope.
Thank you, Alex. Flora, would you like to comment on the question of migration and social protection?
Yeah, I'm also not an expert in that area, but just thinking of what has been happening, like the trends in what prospects that these people who migrate from the Eastern countries, Eastern African countries, or other African countries to developed countries. I think the most important thing is to just look back to the source of the problem, if we can call it problem, like why are these people moving? What is not happening in their country places? And I have examples myself. For instance, I have studied in the US, my master's, my PhD, and stayed there for about 8 years. But I have examples of people who Tanzania to go there either for studies or for work, but just for the 8 years that they've been there, or even more, they've been there. Sometimes they're not that, like, because there are also working restrictions there. There are all these other factors that may not be promotive for them to work if you don't have a valid reason to work there. Or maybe there are some types of jobs that you can qualify as a non-citizen, which is common in other countries as well. Now, if you look at like the status, or like what they have after spending all these years there, and maybe comparing with the fellow friends who remained here at the time when they left, sometimes you just see a very big difference. Like these people back here, maybe they went through several struggles, but in the end they succeeded to be somewhere compared to this person who moved there. And I'm just giving it as an example of some of the cases. But now asking, like, why is these people not motivated to come back, or like what motivated them to leave? Is it what they're living there, or why are they not coming back? It goes back to what is happening here, or what is existing here. Sometimes they feel like, okay, they have all these uncertainties in what is going to go on them. Sometimes they feel they have wasted a lot of time. Maybe better they would have, it would have been better if they remained behind. And so all these come together, but in the end is what is their original country can provide for them. Okay, it can offer them in terms of, okay, now I have lived in the US for all these years, now I'm back, but I don't have proper employment. How are you going, how is social protection going to protect me? Or to like, what is the social safety net aspect in terms of unemployed group of people, or in terms of people who are in transition? Now you are back, you are trying to look for a job that can fit your experience from where. So all this goes back to what the country can offer. And I think the main problem, the main source is what the original country can offer, and what prospects that these people have that not always can be true, because each countries have their own systems, and they have their own ways of accommodating. If they are refugees, that's a different case. Maybe there are certain automatic benefits that you can get, but if you are not, then you may not be getting as much, and so we have to look back. And it's all to the system, the country, the government, what they can do in terms of improving the social protection system and being inclusive enough to cover these groups that are at risk or unemployed or facing some transitional issues in terms of income or in terms of making their lives sustainable. So that's as much as I can think. I'm not an expert. Maybe an expert can do a better job.
Thank you very much, Flora. I would like to take this opportunity now to thank both of you, Alexander and Flora. Alexander, for the presentation of this very interesting report that I'm sure that's going to influence, as Flora said, the research agenda of the international community, but also, and perhaps more important, also of the African researchers that are working on social protection, that are helping their countries to build the national social protection strategies and implementing the programs. I think that there are more questions than answers in the report, and I think that's the beauty of it, is actually to open up our minds to think about the other dimensions of social protection. Perhaps we have been too much focused only on the social cash transfers, only on the public works, and the report has this merit of bringing back the classic pillars of social protection, discussing social assistance, discussing social insurance, discussing employment and active labor market policies, claiming that they should be coordinated, but also looking at cross-sectoral coordination and the developmental role that social protection can have. So I'd like to thank also our audience, Alexander and Flora again. I would also like to invite all the audience to register in the socialprotection.org and also to reply a survey that's going to come up when we finish the webinar transmission. So to you all, thank you very much.